What have we got on Queens, Kings and Dastardly Things today? The history podcast that takes a no-holds-barred look at the royals of yesteryear. Well, we've got a lost queen, an epic journey, and the first time the fork was used in England. Yes, it's England's lost queen, Eleanor, an epic journey in search of the Eleanor crosses. And our guest today is Alice Luxton. Welcome to Queens, Kings and Dastardly Things. I'm Professor Kate Williams. This week Robert's away and I am delighted to be joined by Alice Luxton, incredible historian, author, broadcaster, and we're here to talk about her wonderful book, Eleanor, a 200-mile walk in search of England's lost queen. Welcome, Alice.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's really exciting to be here.
Amazing. We're all in this medieval set. We're all here in the history. And this book about Eleanor of Castile, the wife of Edward I. Now, I had a sneak peek of this because last year I got in touch. I said, Alice, should we go for a drink before Christmas? He said, no, I can't go for a drink because I'm doing a 200-mile walk in December.
Yes.
And I got this email and I thought, Alice is doing a 200-mile walk in December. This is madness. But you did it. You did this epic, huge walk around huge swathe of the country for these amazing Eleanor crosses. But what are the Eleanor crosses in a nutshell?
Well, these are some of the most remarkable monuments in England, but they are completely forgotten by most people. So really, I'm trying to shine a light on them. And following 1290, when Eleanor of Castile died, her husband, Edward I, who was grief-stricken, he built a series of monuments, 12 monuments, the Eleanor crosses, which were located along the route that they carried her body from Lincoln, which is about 200 miles, 150 miles north of London, an amazing town, very historic, very medieval. So they carried her from Lincoln to London and she's buried in Westminster Abbey. So the crosses mark that route. And though they're called the crosses, they're actually these stone monuments which, you know, they probably would have had a cross at the top. That's perhaps why they were called crosses. Or they were located on the crossroads of major roads. So crossways, if you like. And so that's why they're called crosses, though they don't actually look particularly cross-like in their form. And so that is the story of the Eleanor crosses. It's really a great romantic gesture. This is in many ways the Taj Mahal of England's story. And it's all about a warrior king grieving his wife. So it's a story of love and loss, and which is very exciting because you don't often get to see that across the ages, 700 years later.
It's true, there's often a perception, isn't there, that just because marriages are arranged for dynastic purposes, that there's no love or affection there, that people don't feel heartbreak and they don't feel sadness and they don't feel devotion because the marriages are arranged. I mean, this is completely not the case. It was a love match, a devotion love match.
Well, absolutely. I mean, they were pretty lucky, I think. So Eleanor was brought up in the Castilian court, so modern-day Spain, and at the age of about 12, she was married off to Prince Edward of England, so the future King Edward I, or Edward Longshanks, as some people called him, because of his very long legs.
He was maybe about 6'5", 6'4", because obviously by the time they looked at his body, he was older, and one shrinks with old age. I mean, if he was even over 6 foot, I mean, that makes him a giant.
Yeah, it's a pretty tall man. And I think when we think about his legacy, people talk about him as this great warrior king, a great and terrible king. And he certainly was. You know, he went on crusades and he fought the wars in Wales, the wars in Scotland.
He was brutal to the Welsh, brutal to the Scots, expelled the Jews.
Yes, exactly. But of course, what's so interesting about him is that we see him as this brutal figure in many ways, perhaps wrongly in lots of ways. People probably perceive him as the baddie in Braveheart, which you'll be shocked to hear is not a completely accurate depiction. But what I love about this story is we see a different side of him. We see the softer side, we see the romantic side. But going back to the original question, is that he was married to Eleanor when he was in his teens, and it was a diplomatic arrangement to secure Gascony under English control. But luckily for Edward and Eleanor, in the next 36 years, they became a very good team. And from what we can see, they were truly in love. And whereas many medieval queens might have spent time away from their husbands, they really spent as much time as they could together. They were, by all accounts, devoted to each other, and they go on all of these adventures together in some ways. You know, they survive the Second Barons' War, which is a terrible civil war that plays out. They go on crusades together. I mean, Eleanor herself went on crusades, which is pretty incredible.
It's not always that queens go on crusades.
No, absolutely. I mean, Eleanor, if she was alive today, I think she would be on the equivalent of a show like Dragon's Den. You know, she would be a ferocious dragon, a
She'd
businesswoman.
be a dragon.
Yeah.
She'd be saying, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you that.
She was no nonsense.
She was
you
no
know.
nonsense.
She built up big estates in her own way, and I think she, you know, as well as being a great advisor to Edward and with him the whole time, she also was pretty powerful in her own right. But what is often overlooked when we think about medieval women is that whilst all of this was going on and Eleanor was overcoming all of these trials and tribulations, she was also pregnant for most of it. So she gave birth 16 times. Okay, that is a huge
16
physical
times.
toll.
She's constantly pregnant.
Yeah, so always on the go.
16 times, always
on the
travelling.
road. Yeah. But also, very sadly, only 6 of those children survived to adulthood. So you can imagine the kind of angst. And
They have a lot of girls to start off with, don't they? And obviously that's the thing. The queen is there to have a son. That's
to have
her
a
job.
son, and she does, but many of them die. You know, so for her, it must have been very trying. They end up with 5 girls and then a little boy, and that is the future Prince Edward. I always think about them like, you know, if it was the Bennet sisters with a younger son, with a younger brother, or the Romanov family, you know, with the older sisters and then the little boy at the end.
little boy at the end.
So it's very much that kind of dynamic.
That really motivated you, didn't you? The idea that history is everywhere and you can go on this walk to these towns that are not medieval towns anymore. They're very modern places you're going to.
Yeah.
But you can find traces of Eleanor on this epic walk that you go on in December, which was crazy, Alice. What is wrong with May and June?
Yeah, well, I wanted to trace it on the exact days that they were there. So she dies on the 28th of November.
Good historian.
Yeah, I mean, when everyone was at their Christmas parties and things, I was out
That's
in
where I
Lincolnshire countryside, thinking wistfully of what I was missing.
Well, there's literally a whole scene where you and your mum, who's accompanying you at one point, arrive at a guest house, and you were totally freezing. Your feet are almost falling off, and this is all in quest of doing it at the same time. As Eleanor herself was travelling.
Yeah, well, it does really raise all of these points as you're walking and things that you don't think about or you aren't forced to think about when you're sitting in a library or an archive, where you're looking at the day and the kind of light and how that changes. And you suddenly think about all these things like, how on earth did medieval people travel in those short hours that we have? How did they travel without a map? How did they travel through this mud without the modern shoes that we have today? And, you know, how did they have waterproofs? All of these kind of things that you really do think about. But as you mentioned, the real theme of the book is that there is history everywhere. And we just have to take the time to be curious, to look at it. And, you know, in this walk, it was a real cross-section of England in so many different ways. Amazing cathedrals like Lincoln Cathedral, and St Albans, where the history is so visible and obvious in some ways. But equally, some very surprising bits. So many of the crosses were destroyed in the Civil War as these great symbols of royalty. But what actually arose in their place has been quite interesting too. So in places like Stamford, there has been a replica Eleanor Cross in this very, very pointy shape, created by an artist with the fabulous name Wolfgang Buttress. And then,
Go Wolfgang.
Yeah, go Wolfgang. So the last of the crosses that was built was Charing Cross, the most famous one. And the reason...
So that's how we get Charing Cross?
That's it, yeah. So Charing Cross is generally taken to be from Charing, which is a bend in the River Thames, and then the cross, which was the Eleanor Cross, which stood there. It no longer stands today, but that's how we have Charing Cross. And it's actually on the original location of the Charing Cross, of the Eleanor Cross, which is just in front of Trafalgar Square, that all measurements to London are made. So if you type into Google Maps, take me to London, it will take you to the original Eleanor Cross.
So it's Eleanor who is the centre point of London.
Yeah. So what I love about this story, it's not just Eleanor, it's not just the crosses, which were all built within the next 5 years of her death. It's actually how this crazy journey that they've had in the years since. So at Charing Cross, it stood for the whole medieval period. But during the Civil War years, it was one of the first instructions of the parliamentarians to tear down the cross, because they saw it as this great symbol of royalism, and it caused all of these problems.
So that was their big problem. They're in the Civil War. This is 17th century, but our problem is with some random medieval queen. That's the big thing that needs to be dealt with here, guys.
Yeah, you think their priorities might be slightly different.
You think they got bigger fish to fry than that.
That's it. They tore it down, and then this ballad came about saying, "Undone, undone, the lawyers cry. They ramble up and down. They know not the way to Westminster. Now Charing Cross is down."
Everyone's lost.
Everyone's lost. So,
they've all lost their Google Maps.
Yeah,
looking at their medieval, looking at their 17th century photos, going, "Where are we going?" So people said, "Look, I'm not a royalist. I can't bear the kings and queens, but I needed that to find my way to Westminster."
Yeah, so obviously chaos ensued at that point.
Chaos ensued.
But interestingly, it's on that location that was a great symbol of royal imagery that many of the regicides, so that's the figures who signed the death warrant of King Charles I, were executed in the most horrific way. And then to really hammer home the point, they erected a statue of Charles I, so re-established it as a symbol of monarchy on that location. And that equestrian statue is still there today. What is so interesting about that statue is it had actually been created before the Civil War, but someone had to hide it in their garden. So it was buried underground during the Civil War years. But the man who was tasked with destroying it and didn't, had to come up with kind of some evidence that he'd done so. And so he created all of these mementos of little spoons that he sold off as kind of mementos, which obviously all of those souvenir hunters would have been rather disappointed when they actually saw the statue.
Destroy. I've made it into a couple of spoons. Have a spoon.
Yeah.
So not just did he dodge what he'd been told to do, he also made money out of it.
I mean, clever guy.
What
but
a
I don't know
businessman.
I don't know how he got on after the statue went up and everyone was probably knocking on his door
I'm
again.
sorry, my spoon. Sorry, I thought this was worth $1 million, now it's worth 2p.
Yeah, so that's the story of the Charing Cross now. But interestingly, there has been a replica of the original medieval cross, which stands outside Charing Cross station today. So you can see it again, and lots of people walk past that every day in London.
And we don't see it. We walk past it and don't realise what it is.
People don't realise, I know. So there's all this history everywhere. And even on the underground, on the Northern Line platform of Charing Cross Underground Station, there's this enormous mural created by this artist called David Gentleman, and it shows all the original medieval masons creating the cross above. And again, millions of people must walk past that, and many walk past it probably every day and never really clock what they're looking at. So that's a good example of, even in that very small area in the heart of London, so many amazing stories and so many layers of history that people probably aren't aware of. When I was writing this book, it was actually the time when the Pope died. And I remember watching the live stream on the BBC, and you could just see people visiting his body, and just the sound of the cathedral, or as a basilica, of course, St. Peter's, and you know that like echoey sound you get of people's feet shuffling, and then there's a cough, and then you can kind of hear mournful chanting from somewhere else, which is, of course, in Rome, it's a Catholic thing, as it was in England at the time. And it really gave me a sense of what it might have been like when Eleanor's body was taken to these holy sites. So, sometimes we do see elements of that medieval world alive in different ways.
And I think that's what you evoke so brilliantly in the book, that the medieval world, we think it's gone, but it is still there, present under our feet. And we shouldn't imagine the medieval world as dull and dreary. It was vividly coloured, brightly coloured. And the medievals, they thought they were at the frontispiece of history. Sure, they thought they were the most modern people you could ever imagine.
Yeah, I think it's the classic thing in history that we always look back on it and think, in hindsight, everything was very backward and things. But it was pretty impressive when you break down the things that they achieved at that time with the resources that they had. I think a real example of this is the cathedral building, right? The way that in the 13th century they could build some of the most amazing monuments. I mean, just go somewhere like Lincoln Cathedral. It's absolutely incredible.
Well, it didn't get there, of course.
Yeah.
We can go.
Yeah. And in the book, I go on a stone carving course, and just to have a sense of that and the sense of the skill that was there. I think the medieval world is a strange and exciting thing, because it's in some ways full of people who are so similar to us, like exactly the same as us. And, we can see the grief and the loss that Eleanor had losing her children, and the love that they had for each other, and people driven by things like greed or hunger or passion or whatever it might be, things which we can recognise today. But at the same time, it is such a strange world with such wacky practices and ideas. The idea of shrines and pilgrimage. So when medieval people went to a shrine, they believed that they had real power in the same way that we might understand gravity today, like a real force, so that you could stand there and you might actually be healed from this holy relic, and which is obviously a kind of Catholic thing that probably exists in all parts of the world today. But even when Eleanor was giving birth, they might bring a holy relic to ease the pain, which is just a completely different way of thinking about the world.
Thanks. Don't need epidural. I'll have that instead. That'll work. And what about purgatory? So what about the medieval notion of purgatory, and how does that play into the crosses?
Yes. So purgatory was the idea that before going to heaven, you'd spend time in a kind of waiting room.
So I couldn't go straight away.
Yeah,
I'm going to the waiting room.
It's like being in the airport and trying to get on the plane. You know, you've got to spend a lot of time just hanging around in the bit in between.
But there's probably not a duty free to be shopping at.
A lot of time.
So we've gone through departures and we're sitting in the airport waiting room.
And you don't know how long it's going to be, and it can be delayed. As you know, it's out of your control. I think that's the key thing. It's out of your control. And so they had this idea that your soul would go to purgatory and then it would eventually go to heaven. But the way that you could speed up your time through purgatory could either be through good deeds in your own lifetime, or your friends and family or other people could do good deeds on your behalf after you died. So after Ellen had died, people would try and say prayers for her soul to speed up her time through purgatory. And a common practice was to build things like chantry chapels, which were chapels where prayers would be said for that very purpose, which is the usual thing to do. But then, of course, in this situation, the question is, did Edward build the Eleanor crosses perhaps to encourage people to say prayers for Eleanor, to speed her time through purgatory? But the whole idea of purgatory, I think, is so interesting it's a completely different view of life and death.
You don't want to go to purgatory, because I quite enjoy sitting in the Heathrow waiting room. I quite like sitting.
Depends what airports you go
wandering
to.
Around.
Luton?
Good point. Well, I've got my routines in all the airports. I know where the shops I go to buy my snacks. But you don't want to be in the waiting room, do you, in purgatory?
Well, I think heaven's got a lot to
staying there forever.
Exactly. So there's good reason to be getting your friends and family to say prayers. But I mean, the better approach probably would be to just behave well in your own lifetime.
Yes,
that would probably be the more direct response.
Could you guys do it, please? Let's all forgive him about how Henry VIII said, "I want a giant grave, and everyone's going to sing masses over it for the next rest until the end of time." And then they stopped them after a year. So you can't rely on your descendants.
Well, exactly, it's totally out of your control.
Singing prayers forever. Eleanor, as you said at the beginning, is a businesswoman, and she amasses a huge amount of land and estates. And Edward encourages her in that, because otherwise queens don't have an independent income. So she's seen as perhaps rather ruthless in her amassing of property, because no one gets to be a property mogul, perhaps, with a few little practices. But at the same time, this is his way of seeing her as independent if he goes first.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were a real team. Eleanor always knew that Edward was the king, obviously, and she had a very different role as queen, but they had important and separate roles, in their own right. So the legacy of Eleanor is interesting, or the way we perceive her is interesting, because people often point to some aspects of her life where she was seen to be unpopular in her day. There's a few letters which survive which say that people are all up in arms.
There was criticism because she took over loans, didn't she? She took over loans, and she was told off because it involved her taking over loans from Jewish moneylenders. And then Edward expels the Jews. And all of this plays into an image of Eleanor, which is one that she's sort of either forgotten or she's seen as a very ruthless queen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all up for discussion. And I think it's good that we're talking about Eleanor at all, because she's not really generally discussed. We have a few letters where people have written to her saying, you're unpopular across the land, for example. But they are so few in their number. And if you think about all of the sources that could have survived from her life and the very few that have, this is a very narrow kind of survival of letters and documents from her time. So I think perhaps we've been over-reliant on the very few sources that happen to survive, and that's probably bad luck on Eleanor's side. And another way to think about it, if you were being reviewed in your life by a historian 700 years in the future, and the only thing that had survived were 3 emails from a colleague who maybe was jealous of you, maybe resented your wealth and your success, would you think that's a fair review of your life and your work? I mean, you think that was actually a very, very unfair description.
This is it with medieval lives. We have so few sources, and we have to work out which sources are partial and which sources are represent. You're totally right. But tell us about other parts of Eleanor's character. So you said she would be a keen reader of romanticism these days.
Yes, she would be big into romanticy. So
sex and dragons books. That's what romanticy is, you might say. But...
Yeah, probably. I mean, I arrived at that conclusion because...
Best-selling genre at the moment.
Yeah.
£1 million deals. So she would be perhaps writing a romanticy book and earning millions of pounds.
She would be, yeah. She was a savvy businesswoman. She's probably on that sort of thing. The reason I came to that conclusion was because she loved the stories of Arthur and Guinevere. Edward and Eleanor did, as many people did in Europe, but they really lent into them, and they really kind of portrayed themselves as basing themselves on the great tales of King Arthur. And one of the most extraordinary events in their reign comes when Eleanor and Edward claim to find the bones of Arthur and Guinevere, who are these mythological figures. But they have this amazing ceremony where they rebury the bones, and it's at Glastonbury Abbey. Again, if we're going to make a film of their lives, that would be an amazing moment, this king and queen reburying these bones.
So the movie special of Edward and Eleanor is going to show them reburying Arthur's bones.
Yeah, I can imagine it, by the moonlight, and these enormous bones. Apparently Arthur had enormous bones, which you couldn't see Edward Longshanks would be very keen on.
He should know.
Yeah, so there's some pretty epic scenes. Another amazing story of their life was when they were on crusades, and there's this moment where Edward is attacked by an assassin, and he is stabbed with a poisoned dagger. And the story goes that Eleanor, so devoted was she to her husband, and this is a great testament to her love to him, she sucked out the poison from his wound, which is actually pretty horrific to think about, really. And I think medically probably is impossible. But this has been a legend that has been told about them for many, many centuries. But it was also something that was believed by people not too long after they were around and after that would have happened. And so I do think it indicates that people were prepared to believe that they could be capable of acts of love such as that.
Acts of love and acts of magic with Arthur. And also acts of warming your homes, because wasn't Eleanor a key introducer of the carpet?
Oh, yeah. Well, there's a few things that she brought over from, her Castilian youth. One of these is having carpets as decoration. Another was forks. She's said to have been one of the first to use the fork.
Because people would just use bread before to scoop up the food.
Yeah, us English, we had all these terrible habits of, using our hands and using bread. And, a fork did not catch on for many years.
So the fork didn't catch on. Everyone thought, what the heck is that? Yeah. And did the carpet catch on?
Well, I think people of the kind of the top level of society, she did influence the kind of interiors, the interior design.
So I like a carpet. Yeah. And castles always seem to be rather drafty when I go to them. I thought it might have a carpet. That was quite clever.
Quite clever, yeah. And the other thing that she was really into was gardens. So she brought in these kind of Castilian-style gardens. If you imagine a kind of Spanish courtyard with fountains and beautiful trees with fruit on, that kind of thing, that's what she sort of introduced. She introduced here. And you can see some of the influences in the grand castles that were built on the Welsh border, but also at Leeds Castle in Kent, confusingly in Kent, which is a completely different place. It's called the Village of Leeds. And they have a gloriette there, and this was the influence of Eleanor and Edward.
She owned Leeds Castle, didn't she?
Yeah, and it's designed in this way. We can see her kind of influence in designing these kind of buildings, and they had water pumping through and this kind of stuff. So she's big into plumbing.
So water pumping through?
Yeah, to make the fountains,
Right, so we might think that's an 18th century innovation. We might think about Versailles, but they were using underground water pumps.
I mean, she'd be big into Versailles, I think. She'd love
Yes,
that.
yes, pop in. Yeah. Yes, pop in. And look at all those. Well, I could do with a few carpets if you ask me.
Yeah.
Sort that one out.
So she does bring a few influences like that, a few cultural influences.
So when we're eating with a fork, we must remember.
Think of Eleanor.
All thanks to Eleanor.
Yeah, I'm sure she'd love to be remembered as that way.
As a fork. We've had mud, we've had forks, we've had King Arthur. So, I mean, it just is absolutely a gripping book. Here we are, Eleanor, absolutely brilliant book, raved about by so many great historians, such a brilliant reviews. Well, Alice, sadly, that's all we've got time for today. I could talk for hours. It's been such an epic journey. So thank you so much for coming. And thank you to you for listening to Queens, Kings and Dastardly Things. From me, Kate Williams, goodbye.
And from me, thank you so much for having me.